Hey everybody, it's Andre with the Crew Process, and I'm here with an old friend. Well, not an old friend, a long-term friend, David Harris from Prosperident. And David, it's good to see you. How are you?
It's good to see you. And I don't consider myself old. I just think of me as living history.
That I like that. I like that. That's pretty good. Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've connected in such a long time over the topic of embezzlement, which is, it's a sad topic, but it's a topic that comes up pretty often, isn't it?
It sure is. And the best number I can give you is that about 70% of dental practices will be hit sooner or later. So it's not a topic, Andre, that affects a small minority of dentists. This is a mainstream problem.
Yeah. And how long have you been doing this now?
35 years. I did my first investigation in 1989.
Say, and 89 was the when I started my first consulting company. I had been in the dental field for a little while before that, but it's really interesting. And the kind of the way I always looked at it was back in the 80s, early 90s, dental offices could, I'm going to use an analogy, could cut themselves and bleed, and they wouldn't notice it. Now, dental offices are bleeding internally at great quantities, and it still is an internal bleed and they don't see it, but it hurts more. How's that for an analogy?
That's a great one. Yeah, 1989 was before PPOs, and when you could open a dental office for 40 or $50,000 worth of equipment, and you didn't need a cone beam and all the stuff people need now. Yeah, it was kind of a golden age. You're right. I hadn't
Yeah.
really thought of it in that context, but yeah,
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah. I would think when I worked in an office, if somebody threw away a handpiece, it was nothing. It was such a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of the supply order. But now a handpiece could be, you throw away one implant, by accident, and now you're talking about a 5% hit on your supply order for that month. I mean, it's a big difference. So, yeah. So, and one of the things that we share on a regular basis is because I deal with Eaglesoft as sort of a everyday occurrence, and looking at reports, and people are always asking me about reports. Do you find there are some reports that our doctors should be looking at on a daily basis? I mean, you give me an idea of kind of what doctors should be looking for.
Absolutely. And what I try to do when I talk to people about this is come up with a day-end routine that's quick. I know very few doctors who have the mental energy or the discipline to spend a half an hour at the end of a day looking at reports. So I try to come up with a very tight day-end process and then a more intensive month-end process. So to me, at the end of a day, the only thing I want to see is the day sheet. And I think a doctor looking at a day sheet should basically ask themselves two questions. Did what happened today, what happened today consistent with how I remember it? In other words, I'm looking at a patient and I see a two-surface filling, but I remember that one and it was a big four-surface, so did the day sheet deviate from what I remember happened? Because obviously garbage in, garbage out.
Yep.
The second question I want the doctor to ask is, does it make sense? So I'm looking at a patient and I see a 50% adjustment.
Mhm.
Is that real? It could be, but if it is, it's something I should know about. If I'm looking at the hygiene operatory, and if my policy is that people get annual radiography done, if a hygienist saw 12 patients today, then there probably should be somewhere between 4 and 6 sets of film. And if I'm looking at my day and report 3 times in a row, 3 days in a row, and I see three or less sets of periapicals, now I'm starting to wonder what's going on. So day end review is very tight. I tell doctors don't try to follow the money on a daily basis. That should happen monthly.
Yep.
But is it consistent with what I remember and does it make sense? Are the two questions I want you to ask.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
good.
on a month end, now we have to do a lot more. And there are a lot of reports that somebody could look at, but at a minimum, I want you to look at a month end summary report for your practice that's kind of like a longer version of the day end report. I also want you to look at receivables and to break receivables into three parts, being amounts owing from insurance companies, amounts owing from patients, and credit balances. And each of those mean different things, and they should get attention. And Eaglesoft is really good at letting the doctor break those out separately.
Mhm.
One more thing about reports, Andre. I think that if I'm a practice owner, the reports I rely on should be ones that I printed myself. As soon as I allow somebody else to hand me a printed report, I have opened the door wide to selective reporting.
Yep.
And I'm not going to get into details about how it's done, but I know you being one of the smartest guys I know in dentistry, that you can close your eyes very quickly and picture it.
Yep.
So if you're in the audience and you have questions, Andre or I can fill you in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I always tell people, as a business owner, you're a business owner, one of the things I look at is trends. And I look at, dental offices, and if you have noticed, I'm an analogy person. I want my reports to look like a dolphin swimming. I need it to go up and down like this.
Yes.
I never want to see a whale. I don't want to see this huge dip, and then the office comes back up for air and is gasping for income. There should be a constant movement of the practice, and it should increase. I mean, hopefully, but we should be looking at things, and then the abnormalities, those deep dives and those deep peaks are where you should be looking at why. It's the why about it. N- You know, uh, like you said, the day sheet at the end of the day, one of the things I'm a huge proponent of is there really should be nothing in the adjustment column that somebody can't justify without a but. There should be no asterisks in a report, you know.
Very true. And the other thing I tell doctors is if you have a question about something like an adjustment,
Mhm.
rather than ask somebody, which is the instinct of most dentists, build the mindset of going back to documents.
Yep.
So, can I please see the EOB on that patient?
Right.
And work from a document rather than asking people questions. Because if somebody is playing games with you and you ask a question, they're just going to spin you around and around and let you go.
Yeah.
I'm going to add one more thing to the month end task list that very few people cover. And I call it articulation. And I'm very consciously borrowing a term from dentistry because I want every dentist to have the picture of the mandible and the maxilla.
Mhm.
But what I mean by articulation, and this is financial articulation, is this. If your practice was open 14 days last month, and in one hand, you have 14 of those day end reports that you've printed and checked off at the end of each day. And when you check a day end report, just put your initials on it so you know that's the one you saw. So you have those 14 reports that you checked. Now you print a month end summary. And what you do is you add up the fees and adjustments and payments from the 14 reports. And they should be exactly, and I mean to the penny, the same as the month end summary.
Yep.
If they're not, what that means is that somebody came in after hours and they did stuff they did not want you to see. So that's the one step that is not taught anywhere else, but it's a way of making sure that nothing has been done in a way that makes it have an end run around your scrutiny.
Yeah. And one of the things that I realized, and the blip on the map for all of us was COVID and 2020. I praise 2020 in one way. So many of the doctors had to become the managers of the business because they did not have people working there. And they took on ownership and management of their own businesses, which they had abdicated for such a long time. And I praise 2020 every day because of so many people who were locked into taking care of their own businesses and contacted me and saying, I never ran an end of day or end of month or whatever, and I don't know what these reports mean. Help me. And those doctors became the CEOs of their own dental practices that year.
It was a really busy time for us, and it's interesting that you mention it because that's something I don't think I've ever verbalized with anybody before, but it was a really busy time for us and for exactly the reason that you mentioned. The doctors started doing things themselves and suddenly they started seeing things that weren't right.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate to use this, but before I came into dentistry, I was in retail. I was in really high-end retail. And one of the one of my clients, customers was Bill Cosby,
Hmm.
good or bad. But one of the things he always said was, you know, no matter how rich I am, I sign every one of my checks. You know, it's such a real thing that you have to touch your money.
Yeah.
You've got to be the guy who's sort of the last person in charge of your own money, if nothing else.
Yeah, and if you do not match collections according to Eaglesoft with deposits at the bank,
Yep.
what you're doing to yourself is you're allowing the stupidest, laziest thief on the planet to steal from you.
Yeah.
If you enforce collections versus deposits, and again, I think that should be done on a monthly basis and not daily.
Yep.
If you check that, now you're increasing the challenge for a thief exponentially, because now to steal from you, what they have to do is teach Eaglesoft to lie about how much money came in, which certainly can be done, but that takes a lot more knowledge and imagination than simply recording payments in Eaglesoft and not depositing the money in the bank.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the most interesting things I always tell people is, I always try to forward all of your newsletters when it has the wall of shame that comes out, because seeing some of the things that finally hit the press, I mean, what percentage you think actually hit the press of the incidents that happen?
Oof. Good question. I'm thinking 20 to 25%.
Yeah. And it's
Um,
interesting to see some of the cases so that people go, you know what, I never thought about that. I never thought that that was, now that it's public and they can see that's happened. I never thought that that could possibly happen.
the mental picture that a lot of dentists have of a thief is a little bit oversimplified.
Yeah.
Um, and I've heard many dentists say to me, I don't think I have a problem because frankly, my office manager is too stupid to steal. And later on they realize they do in fact have a problem, and they just underestimated their adversary.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
there's a meme or whatever that says like, it, you can imagine if a heroin addict has to come up with $100 a day, that they're brilliant. You know, that's a lot of money to come up with. And full disclosure, a former coworker of mine is on your wall of shame.
uh, I don't know that I knew that, but
Yeah. Well, somebody I was a consultant, and she was one of the people who was sort of a customer service person at our consulting company.
mm,
And she then worked in a dental practice and wound up on your on your page. And it was striking because all I could think about was, here's somebody who was so well trained to be able to look at the numbers, and review data and understand all of the dental software out there. And she took that knowledge to a different level.
yeah.
Yeah.
And just for the benefit of the audience, the Hall of Shame that Andre is talking about is a part of our website where we profile embezzlers. And we have, I think the last time I counted, we had about 820 embezzlers in our Hall of Shame. And we tell everything there. I mean, there are pictures, there are, descriptions of what they did, what happened to them. We put all that information into the public domain, in part so that the next dentist who's about to hire this person has a place they can go and find out what the history is.
Yeah. And
And
it's crazy how many people don't check.
we get calls 3 or 4 times a year typically from somebody who says, yeah, last night I was stumbled across your website and I looked at your Hall of Shame and my office manager's there.
Yeah.
We get those calls somewhat regularly, and yeah, we put this out there as a public service and a warning. And one caution that I'll give the audience is, of course, a lot of thieves will do things like apply for work in your office using a different name than the one they were convicted in. So that's where the pictures come in, and you can search our Hall of Shame by city or state or any other characteristic you can think of. But sometimes the people do reinvent themselves, let's say, as a way of trying to hide their baggage.
Yeah.
The other thing on that topic, while we're talking about hiring, is the audience should know that 70 million Americans, which is 1 in 4 adults, has a criminal record. So if you are hiring people and not doing a criminal records check, you're playing Russian roulette and you will lose.
Yeah. And again, go back to my before dentistry days, just for me to sell clothing, I had to be bonded, so it was a process that I had to go through with, background check, fingerprinting, lie detector, all this kind of stuff just to sell clothing. So it's amazing that when I was hired as a front desk person to run $1 million business, it was basically, hey, come on and sit down at the desk and you'll learn as you go. That was the entirety of the background check, although it was family, but that was the entirety of the background check.
Yeah, and unfortunately, dentistry has allowed itself to become incredibly casual in how it hires people.
Yeah,
Another thing I'll mention is that it astounds me the number of dental practices that don't drug test applicants.
yeah,
And if you're a dentist and you have a DEA license, I mean, you have the keys to the pharmacy.
yeah,
And if I had a drug problem, the place I'd like to work the most is probably a perio practice or an oral surgery practice because controlled substance prescriptions fly out of there the way candy leaves my house at Halloween.
yeah.
Um, and yet the norm in dentistry is that we don't drug test people who apply for work, and it makes no sense.
Yeah. It's a very interesting field, and we're veterans in this business. It's amazing when I talk about the business of dentistry to people outside of dentistry, they just sort of shake their heads. Uh, how do you guys survive? And it's lasted for hundreds of years, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, you said it a while ago, that prosperity will hide a certain amount of inefficiency or theft or mistakes that business owners make. Although I agree with your hypothesis that dentistry has less ability to withstand that stuff now than it did maybe when you and I got into the business.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and what are you seeing in trends? I mean, what are you seeing across the country? Because you deal with people all over the States and in Canada, right?
We do.
Yeah.
Trends, well, the first thing, of course, is that DSOs continue to gobble up practices and grow.
Mhm.
I don't see the place ever where, the independent practice is a dinosaur and doesn't exist anymore. But that's the past 5 years have been pretty significant in terms of DSOs marching into the world.
Yeah.
And I always think of it like restaurants. Sometimes I go to an independent restaurant, sometimes I go to a chain.
Yeah.
I know I'm going to have a different experience in each place, but sometimes one is right and not the other. And I think if you're listening to this and you're an independent practice owner, don't feel like somebody's going to pull the rug out from under your feet. You just have to differentiate yourself in ways that DSOs can't.
Yeah.
So that's one trend. The parallel trend is practices that are not DSOs but are multi-practice owners. When I started in this game, the objective of everybody in dental school was to graduate, associate for a couple of years, and buy a practice. And now it seems like the objective is to associate for a couple of years, buy a practice, then 2 more years, buy another one, and get up to 5 practices. So,
Yeah.
the people with an entrepreneurial spirit in dentistry tend to be moving to the front now, where I don't think I would have said that in 1989.
Right. Yeah. It was more of a craftsman idea then,
Yeah.
and now it's more of a CEO position now. So
Yeah, I mean, you have this class of people I will call dental entrepreneurs, and there are people who are business people but happen to be dentists, and that category really didn't exist
yeah,
back then. And frankly, I think that's a great trend. I mean, it allows people to decide what they're good at and go after it.
I agree.
Whether my joy in life is being a clinician, or I'm a dentist. I like patients, but my bigger interest is finding the next acquisition and assimilating it, and bringing the staff in that practice to a level they didn't think they could get to.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you two questions as we start to wrap up. And the first question, I'm going to ask you two questions in succession, then you can answer. I'll let you think about question two as you're answering question one. So you multitask. Question one, uh, advice to a dentist at any level in their career right now. Question two is, what book should all dentists be reading?
Okay, I'm going to answer those in reverse order because the
There
first
you go.
one's really easy.
Yep.
The book I would like every dentist to read is right here.
Healer versus. Love it.
I've written two books on embezzlement. This was the second book I wrote, and it's fairly in depth. It's about 350 pages, and there is so much advice in here on how to run a good practice and how to make sure that somebody isn't sticking their hand into your wallet. So I would like every practice owner or aspirant practice owner to read that.
At home.
Well, they could even read it in the office as a way of waving the flag or showing people that, yes, I am interested in keeping my money.
Good.
Advice for dentists. I could give a lot, but I'm gonna come down to one thing, and it's a word that you used earlier in the conversation. I talk to dentists a lot about the difference between delegation and abdication. Delegation meaning, Andre, you're my office manager. I'm going to give you a job to do, and then I'm going to commit the time and the mental energy to monitoring your performance or evaluating how you're doing that job.
Yeah.
And abdication meaning, I'm giving you this job and I don't ever want to hear about it again.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of dentists abdicate when what they really need to do is delegate. The other advice, you asked for one, but I'm going to throw in a bonus.
Go for it.
The second advice I'll give you is do not ever confuse somebody who knows 15 or 20% more than you do with an expert. I see a lot of dentists asking each other for advice that really needs to go to an attorney or a forensic accountant or a software specialist or a practice management consultant. But just because the guy down the street is more successful than you are and drives a bigger car, does not mean that he has a mastery of whatever topic you're about to ask.
I love it. I love it.
So let's ask the experts when we have pressing questions.
Yeah, my mother, professor of sociology, my professor of sociology in college, says all the time. She says there's a difference between an expert and a professional. And she said a cashier is a professional. That means they get paid for doing what they do. Your dad's an accountant. He's an expert. So big
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there are lots and lots of people in my world who have opinions that aren't necessarily weighed down by a whole lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
For example, in Facebook groups, and I see this all the time, and I know you have too, somebody will post and say, I think my office manager is stealing from me. What should I do next?
Uh,
And 10 dentists will chime in and say, call the police.
yeah.
And I kind of sit back and let this happen. And then I will chime in and say, and tell them what exactly.
Yeah.
I think I'm being stolen from, but I'm not sure. I think I know who's doing it, but I'm not absolutely sure. I have no idea how much money's gone. The police can't work in that framework. It's not their job to solve the crime for you. You have to tell them what you've lost, and after that, they'll get the law applied. But all these well-intentioned people will chime in.
Yeah.
And like I say, don't confuse somebody who knows a little more than you do with an expert.
Yeah. And Facebook has very few experts
It's true.
in
A lot
all
of people with
topics.
opinions.
In all topics, yeah. Well, I really appreciate this, and I haven't, I was trying to figure out the last time I think I haven't run into you in a long time. Facebook's been great, but we've lost 5 years with COVID. But I think the last time we've run into each other was the ADA meeting in Washington, D.C., which was
Ooh,
2015, 2016.
2016, yeah, somewhere around
Wow.
there. You're right. Yeah, it's been a decade. Well,
Yeah.
okay, we got to do something about this.
Yeah, so we'll have to catch up real soon. But I really appreciate doing this, and I'm going to put links in the notes, and we're going to put some information here so you guys can get in touch with David. If you suspect there's an issue, if you just have a question and there's not a suspect, but just a question, make the call. Don't wait years and years and years for things to just settle themselves. Make the call and find out if you need to go any further, but make the call first. And if David will tell you if you don't need to have any more issues, but make the call. And I'm glad you're there backing us up.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks for having me on.
Good to see you.